Hello and welcome to this episode of Congressional Conversations, where we discuss the priorities of New York's Jewish community with members of the New York Congressional Delegation. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. Today, hailing from the 7th Congressional District, we welcome our good friend, Representative Nydia Velazquez. Representative Velazquez is chairwoman of the House Small Business Committee, a senior member of the Financial Services Committee, a member of the House Committee on Natural Resources, and she's also a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and the Democratic Caucus. Welcome to Congressional Conversations, Congresswoman Velazquez.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Michael. And by the way, I'm also a member appointed by the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, on the Select Committee on COVID-19. This is a select committee that the Speaker put together to investigate the response to COVID-19 under the previous administration, and it will continue to assess where we are today.
Thank you for mentioning that. And actually, that's exactly where we're going to start our conversation. Just for our viewers, Congresswoman Velazquez and I have known each other for a long time, from the time we were teenagers. And as issues have arisen, she has been a leader on many of the issues of concern to our community and certainly of concern to New Yorkers. And you have been, as you just mentioned, a leader on COVID relief. So we're going to talk about some of the initiatives that you've put through to help New Yorkers. And let's start with my profession. We're in the not-for-profit world. So what about the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, which impacts a lot on small businesses? We'll get to that a little bit down the road. But what about on not-for-profits, on nonprofits? There's so many of them in the New York area and across the country.
So when, in order to provide relief, especially in terms of the economy and the important role that small businesses play, we back in February and March, we passed a relief package that only had the EIDL program, and that is the Economic Injury Disaster Program that provides loans, low interest loan to small businesses. But then, the pandemic continued to impact negatively our economy, and not only small businesses, but also the non-for-profit sector. And Michael, if there is anything that this pandemic has shown us, is the fact that the most vulnerable communities were the most impacted. The high rate of those that contracted COVID-19 and died from it were African-American and Latino communities. And so we passed a relief package and we created a new program that is the PPP. And that program provides loan that will be forgiven if you maintain the workers on payroll. And so we established a ratio of 60 to 40. 60% will have to go to the workers to maintain the workers, and 40% we provided flexibility. But last December, we passed another package and we didn't expand the PPP to cover the non-for-profit sector. And if we have seen anything out of this pandemic, is the important role that non-for-profits have provided throughout our nation, particularly again, with most vulnerable communities who has been, we have seen food insecurity like never before. Since the Great Recession in the 40s and 45. So My committee has been the one designing these programs, and I insisted in December for it to cover the non-for-profit, but we failed in the fact that we didn't have the support coming out of the Republicans in the House and in the Senate. But now in this $1.9 trillion,
yes,
representing the vision of the president, Joe Biden, we are going to include the non-for-profit sector and every, non-for-profits with 300 or fewer employees will now be eligible. And also they can apply for PPP. And for those who already apply and got a loan, but they continue to struggle, they will be able to apply for a second draw of PPP loans.
well, thank you very, very much. And that really is a lifeline to many not-for-profits, including our own. Speaking of vulnerabilities, you kind of touched on the edges, but let's dive more deeply into it. That's healthcare. Healthcare reform. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated healthcare disparities. What reforms in the healthcare system might you propose to eliminate those disparities?
Well, Michael, as you mentioned, if anything this pandemic has done is to lay bare the systemic inequities that exist in our economy and our healthcare system, especially with vulnerable communities and the African American and Latino community. So I am committed to expanding healthcare and making equitable investments into public health infrastructure as we work towards Medicare for all. The House recently passed HR 1319, the American Rescue Plan, which expands access to healthcare during the pandemic for workers and families who lost jobs based coverage. So specifically, it's going to provide subsidies to ensure workers who have been laid off or subject to reduced hours can access affordable health coverage. And for workers not eligible for this relief, the bill improves support for health coverage through the ACA marketplace, helping small businesses, self-employed, and the gig economic workers impacted by the pandemic. So the president is committed to make sure that we open the enrollment for ACA, but also that we do a more aggressive outreach so that people know when to apply. In the past, under Obama, we spent a lot of money with advertisements so that we provided information to the people so that they knew the important opportunity that they had in front of them by enrolling into ACA.
Yeah, and that's so important. We've talked about nonprofits, talked about healthcare. Housing has to be the next one up. Please explain this Public Housing Capital Fund and how that might provide some solutions to the affordable housing crisis in New York and across the country.
Well, again, those who live in public housing and Black, Latinos, Asian Americans are not only dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the fact of the conditions, the physical conditions of the housing infrastructure in our nation, particularly in New York. We have the largest public housing developments in the country are in New York, and the infrastructure of public housing is in crisis.
Yeah.
So what we hear and what we know is that there is a backlog in modernization and infrastructure repairs of almost $40 billion, if not much more. So what the argument that I'm making here is, if we need to treat public housing as part of our infrastructure, as part of our national infrastructure, like bridges, like roads. And so I introduced a bill that calls for an investment of $70 billion. And most of that money will go to, obviously, New York. New York stands to get close to $40 billion. Yeah. But we need that type of investment in order to make a public housing whole again. You know, public housing in New York City used to be the envy of our entire country. But the fact of the matter is that there has been a disinvestment of not only federal money, but state and city money. And for many hardworking families who are working 2 and 3 jobs and who live in public housing, this is the last frontier for them. If we allow for public housing to disappear and there's no other way to deal with it than shutting down some of the development because they are not safe, what is going to happen with working families in our country? So we are working very hard, and pretty soon people in this country are going to hear the introduction of my bill in the Senate with some important senators introducing it, but also co-sponsoring the legislation.
Well, look forward to seeing that happen, and congratulations on the legislation, which is so important for New Yorkers and those who live, not only for those who live in the developments, but those who live in the city as a whole, to improve our quality of life. And speaking of improvements of quality of life, of course, during this pandemic, vaccines have been the godsend. And now with the introduction of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we now have 3 very effective vaccines which are out there. The big challenge is one of supply. So what does your most recent legislation provide for COVID awareness, COVID vaccines, COVID supply? And I'm just throw as an addendum to that, is that the state of Israel has been very, very successful in managing their response to the pandemic and vaccinating. I saw this morning over 80% I think over 88% of people who are in the elderly category, which is just incredible. It is a small country, but nonetheless, they were able to mobilize. What can we do here in America, people for waiting for that jab to go into their right or left shoulder?
So, look, Michael, the problem is that we didn't have a national strategy. The problem is when you have a person in the White House saying that it is up to the state and the city. No, this is a pandemic. This is a national emergency. And when we are dealing with a national crisis, the role of the federal government is to show up, is to coordinate a response, a cohesive, comprehensive response. And in order for a governor or a president or a mayor to say, we want to open the economy, well, it doesn't work that way. The first thing that we need to do is to crush the virus. And then people will have, consumers, peace of mind to go into a restaurant or go to a mall or go into a store, unless we know that we are succeeding in increasing the number of people that get vaccinated. We're not going to have that peace of mind. The same with the schools. Parents need to know that when they send their children into the classroom, that resources have been invested in retrofitting the ventilation system that will protect the children, but also protect the teachers that are going to be in those classrooms. Right. So it takes resources, and that really explains why it's so important that the federal government takes charge. But this has to have different elements that we need to build into this federal response. We have seen that the rate of vaccination is very low when it comes to those most vulnerable. And so I went to the White House with Nancy Pelosi, our speaker, to meet with the president. And I told the president, we cannot crush the virus unless we use everything that we can to help those communities that are hard to reach communities to get the vaccine. But we don't have the infrastructure in some of those communities. And in so many cases we do, but we are not using them effectively. And that is why I said to the president, we need to work with the federal community health centers that are in low-income communities. They trust those doctors, they trust and they know those nurses. And it is that element of trusting, is that element of feeling safe that they are telling them the truth and that they could trust the vaccine. So that's why I introduced a bill, the bill Building COVID-19 Vaccine Confidence Act of 2021, that will require the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to award targeted grants to local health departments and nonprofit organizations to conduct outreach on the vaccine's safety and efficacy. You know that in the past, many Black and Latinos has been used as testing for situations that we have that we have not been good partners in that sense. So there is that element of trust, and in order to build on that, we need to provide those local organizations that people trust to be able to do the outreach, to be able to provide information and to educate so that we could increase the number of people in those communities to get the vaccine.
Right, you're absolutely correct. I think those FQHCs are really essential to make sure that trusted voices and trusted medical professionals are the ones who are providing the vaccines, and they're the ones who also provide the education about vaccination and about this pandemic very accurately and very trustworthily, if that's such a word. And I want to go back to the Israel question. I want to expand it a little bit. You're a member of the Progressive Caucus and have a long history of being supportive of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Travel to Israel has been challenged by some in progressive circles. Can you speak to the importance of being someplace and seeing the issues firsthand? You don't have to necessarily agree with every policy of any government whose country you visit, including the state of Israel. But isn't travel essential to learn about the issue through investigation as opposed to relying on other sources?
Oh, definitely. I think that our responsibility as members of Congress, and one of our duties is to deal with foreign policy, making sure that we make a contribution in the Middle East or any part of the world. And in order to be able to craft policy and legislation, we need to really have that first-hand knowledge that comes from visiting countries around the world and being able to interact with parliamentarians, members, and legislators, and being able to travel and tour and see on the ground what the situation is, because that gives us a better understanding on the issues, and especially, to be able to come back and share that information and share that knowledge with other members.
Well, thank you. I certainly, obviously, very, very supportive of that point of view. And although we're not talking about a country overseas, we're talking about Puerto Rico in a moment. But as a native Yabucoa, if I remember correctly,
Yes.
Puerto Rico, in what way can you, do you as a member of Congress, support the island and its people, especially during this pandemic? I was there after Hurricane Maria and saw the devastation that the island still has not fully recovered from. In fact, the state of Israel, through its IsraAid program, provided a water filtration system without electricity needed that was so essential to the rainforest area of the villages in central Puerto Rico. Anyway, there's a debt crisis in Puerto Rico. There's small business in Puerto Rico. You're the chairwoman of the Small Business Committee. What kind of relief can Congress now provide? The Democratic Party controls the House, controls the Senate, more or less, and has the executive branch. What can we do for Puerto Rico as the United States of America?
Thank you, Michael, for that question. And thank you and your organization and the Jewish community in New York City and across the country. Your response and advocacy on behalf of Puerto Rico right after the hurricane or hurricanes,
yes.
more than one, and then the earthquakes, is something that I really admired and I'm so grateful. Especially at a time when the support and the resources that were approved by Congress were not making its way to Puerto Rico. It was important that organizations like the one that you represent and the cooperation from the Jewish community to provide for water assistance in Puerto Rico. My God, how many people died because they didn't have water, and that was contaminated and so on. So look, one of the first things that the president did, Biden, was to release funding that we appropriated, Congress appropriated right after Maria. And the President Trump was withholding that money because for whatever reason, I think that in his mind, Puerto Ricans were not American. They were American, but I guess second-class citizens. Look, right now, we are advocating for the federal government and the Congress to provide funding for Medicaid and funding for SNAP. 65% of the children in Puerto Rico live in poverty. 65%. And so how can we provide parity in those programs that could save the life of the people of Puerto Rico? And these are American citizens. Whenever the US government asks Puerto Ricans to go to war, they show up. And in this particular instance, it is the responsibility of the federal government to provide the resources so that we could make Puerto Rico whole again.
Yes, that's so critical. Such a beautiful island. Let me wrap up with one question, and that's immigration policy. The pandemic has really exacerbated many things. Among them is how we deal with immigrants. Are you hopeful that during the course of the 117th Congress that true immigration policy reform can be enacted?
Yes. As you know, we introduced the legislation that President Biden presented to us. Next week, on March 18th, March 16th, We were supposed to be back in our districts. We're going to be here in Washington. We are going to be marking up and voting on immigration reform. I've been very much involved. I am one of 7 women that they call the closers, and we are the one whipping members and explaining to members the provisions of the bill. But one way or another, we are going to have some kind of immigration reform.
Oh, good. So
and bring justice to the many people, to the
yes.
dreamers, to TPS holders, to the many families who have been in this country for so long. We cannot expect 12 million immigrants to be sent back to their countries. They have children here that are American citizens. This is a broken immigration system, and it's morally wrong to separate children from their parents. That is not who we are. Those are not our values, and we have to make sure that we pass comprehensive immigration reform that will bring peace of mind to many families that are today in pain, suffering family separation.
I know you have to leave. I just want to give you one opportunity. I definitely want to have another conversation with you like this. This has been very, very rewarding, very illuminating. What about a last word to our viewers, many of whom are Jewish, some of whom may not be Jewish, but it'd be wonderful for you to share a brief thought with us, and then I'll close the program.
So, Michael, for me, it's a great honor and a privilege to represent my constituents in the 7th Congressional District. My district is one of the most diverse districts in the nation. And at a time when there has been some incidents of hate crime, either anti-Semitism or anti-Asian or anti-Latinos, we could give lessons to the entire country about a city where we embrace diversity, where we respect each other, where we care about our neighbors. And that is my district. I'm very proud, and we will continue to fight hate crimes, whether by passing legislation, whether by appropriating funds so that we could empower non-for-profits to be able to do the kind of work that will bring people together. We will continue to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, our dear friend, Representative Nydia Velazquez. I can't thank you enough for spending time with us on Congressional Conversations. Look forward to having you coming back again, because I have a lot more questions to ask. I thank all of our thanks. I thank all of our viewers for watching, and to learn more about the issues we discussed today and much more, please check out JCRC-NY's website for our focus on communal priorities. It's available on jcrcny.org. See you next time on Congressional Conversations. Thanks again. We're very, very grateful to Congresswoman Velazquez for joining us. Shalom.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Shalom.
Adios.